All right, I'm live. This is it. I don't know if anyone's watching, but I'm going to try and not think too much about the audience because I'm mainly doing this for myself. I've got the Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. I was given this book around 20 years ago at a men's circle I was involved in at the time by sorry, I'm just going to quit my email so I stop getting alerts. I was given it by the host of a men's circle I was involved in around 20 years ago as something to help you better understand yourself for whatever I was going through at the time, which was a journey of tapping into deeper authenticity. And this book has just sort of floated, around my life. It's been at my desk. I went through a garage clean out this weekend and it was in a box in my garage. Sure, some of you guys have books like that have just kind of been around and you're like, I'm going to read it. There's something in this book for me. So, and I've never read it. I barely even opened it. I'm embarrassed to admit. And so my main reason for doing this is I thought that this is a great way for me to put some pressure on myself to actually read this. So I'm doing this for me, and hopefully this benefits someone else as well. So this is The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. And he wrote this in 1957, I believe. And I discovered Carl Jung, really I've been coming across him the last couple of years because a lot of people talk about Carl Jung online, which is mostly how I've been exposed to him. But I also think this is kind of even falling apart. But I think if you're in the world of self-development or spirituality, I mean, I think it's safe to say that a lot of what is out there right now is informed by Carl Jung. I think the guy was groundbreaking. He spoke about things that had never been spoken about. He came up with the idea of the shadow, which if you've done any self-development work, especially now, everyone's talking about the shadow and shadow work. It's the guy who came up with it. Sorry, that's blurry, but that's the guy. He came up with the idea of the shadow, the collective unconscious. So anyway, this page is falling out. The Undiscovered Self, and this is $2.95 when it was purchased. So this is obviously an old edition that I'm grateful to have been gifted years ago. So all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to plan to read through this and try my best to make sense of this book, which I know was given to me for an important reason. So here we go. The Undiscovered Self. I wish I could show the kind of pages as I'm reading, but I'll just read. So chapter 1, the plight of the individual in modern society. And remember, this was first copywritten. This was copyright 1957. What will the future bring? From time immemorial, this question has occupied men's minds, though not always to the same degree. Historically, it is chiefly in times of political, physical, economic, and spiritual distress that men's eyes turn with anxious hope to the future, and when anticipations, utopias, and apocalyptic visions multiply. Apocalyptic visions. Sounds familiar, right? One thinks, for instance, of the chiliastic expectations of the Augustan age at the beginning of the Christian era, or of the changes in the spirit of the West, which accompanied the end of the first millennium. Today, as the end of the second millennium draws near, we are again, this is fascinating, we are again living in an age filled with apocalyptic images of universal destruction. Could have been written today, right? What is the significance of that split symbolized by the Iron Curtain, which divides humanity into two halves? Fascinating. What will become of our civilization and of man himself if the hydrogen bombs begin to go off, or if the spiritual and moral darkness of state absolutism should spread over Europe? Amazing how relevant this is right now, right? We have no reason to take this threat lightly. Everywhere in the West, there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. I had a hard time processing that, so I'm going to read that again. We have no reason to take this threat lightly. I got that. Everywhere in the West, there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. I'm not totally processing that, but if you are, feel free to share in the chat. One should not, however, overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. This is escaping me a little bit. Okay. Everywhere. So let's slow down, because that's a complex phrase. And I'm a slow learner. Okay. That's why I was embarrassed to do this. So everywhere in the West, there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally. Okay, I'm going to keep going. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. Also, it is regionally dependent on public education and is subject to the influence of acutely disturbing factors of a political and economic nature. So Lynette said, polarization, people in the middle have the smarts to step out of the rhetoric, but we've got to stop the indoctrination. Yes. People in the middle have the smarts to step out of the rhetoric. That's, yes, we have to stop the indoctrination. A rather more pessimistic view would be unjustified either, since the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities. That's true. And even when it exists, it proves to be wavering and inconsistent. The more so, as a rule, the bigger the political groups are. The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual, and this necessarily leads to doctrinaire and authoritarian tyranny if ever the constitutional state should succumb to a fit of weakness. Rational argument can be conducted with some prospect of success only so long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree. If the effective temperature rises above this level, the possibility of reasons having any effect ceases and its place. Okay. This is surpassing my ability to easily process in this way. And I think if I was reading this, I would probably slow down a lot more, which I guess is what I should be doing here. It's much more intellectual and like kind of heady than I expected, but let's keep going and I'll see what I can get out of this. Maybe I'll just jump around a little bit. What is commonly called self-knowledge is therefore, actually, let's rewind a little bit. Most people confuse self-knowledge with knowledge of their conscious ego personalities. I get that. You know, the idea that self-knowledge is about who I am, what my personality is at the surface level, right? What I'm aware of. Anyone who has any ego consciousness at all takes it for granted that he knows himself. So the idea that people who are familiar with their personality or familiar with who they are at the surface level believe that they know themselves. But the ego knows only its own contents, not the unconscious and its contents. That's interesting. So the ego knows the ego. The ego is not aware of what's unconscious. People measure their self-knowledge by what the average person in their social environment knows of himself, but not by the real psychic facts, which are for the most part hidden from them. So here he's sort of getting at the shadow and the parts of us that are unconscious. I'll read that again. People measure their self-knowledge by what the average person in their social environment knows of himself, but not by the real psychic facts, which are for the most part hidden from them. We don't see who we really are. In this respect, the psyche behaves like the body with its physiological and anatomical structure, of which the average person knows very little too. Although he lives in it and with it, most of it is totally unknown to the layman, and specific scientific knowledge is needed to acquaint consciousness with what is known of the body, not to speak of all that is not known, which also exists. I think he's just saying there's a lot below the surface for most of us. There's a lot below the surface in our psyche, and even within our bodies. There's a lot below the surface of what we understand or are able to intuit. I think that's what he's getting at. And then he goes on, what is commonly called self-knowledge is therefore a very limited knowledge. Got that, right? Talk about self-knowledge. For most of us, it doesn't go very deep. Most of it is dependent on social factors of what goes on in the human psyche. Hence, one is always coming up against the prejudice that such and such a thing does not happen with us or in our family or among our friends and acquaintances. And on the other hand, one meets with equally illusory assumptions about the alleged presence of qualities which merely serve to cover up the true facts of the case. Let me read that again. Hence, one is always coming up against the prejudice that such and such a thing does not happen with us or in our family. In other words, I guess he's saying we tend to deny that we are something that maybe we actually are because we don't see ourselves clearly. So one is always coming up against the prejudice that such and such a thing does not happen with us or in our family or among our friends and acquaintances. And on the other hand, one meets with equally illusory assumptions about the alleged presence of qualities which merely serve to cover up the true facts of the case. In this broad belt of unconsciousness, which is immune to conscious criticism and control, we stand defenseless, open to all kinds of influences and psychic infections. I do find this an exercise to read. It takes a lot of focus. And like I said, I'm a slow processor. So this is, this kind of thing that might take me a few reads to really absorb. But I guess my goal here is just to maybe extract some general insights. Maybe I should just kind of go quickly and kind of see what I get in maybe kind of a quick scan. As with all dangers, we can guard against the risks of psychic infection only when we know what is attacking us and how, where, and when the attack will come. Since self-knowledge is a matter of getting to know the individual facts, theories help very little in this respect. For the more a theory lays claim to universal validity, the less capable it is of doing justice to the individual facts. And theory based on experience is necessarily statistical. Let's jump ahead a little bit. The statistical method shows the facts in the light of the ideal average. Let's skip around a little bit. Now, whether it is a question of understanding a fellow human being or of self-knowledge, I must in both cases leave all theoretical assumptions behind me, since scientific knowledge not only enjoys universal state. In view of the fact, the illustration in the case of medicine. Let's see what he's talking about here. The doctor, in view, under the influence of scientific assumptions. This is very scholarly. It's a little dense, right? It's not written for it's not, this isn't what most of us come across online today, which is just something to be easily absorbed in 2 seconds, right? You got to really bring your focus, which, reminds me of how much my focus has been scattered lately. And it's important, right? It's important to read. This is why it's important to get to the core of concepts that reach the mainstream, and you kind of get bite-sized pieces. And you really have to maybe go into a deeper space to relate to material on a deeper level. And doing it on a live stream like this, maybe it's not the best way to do it, but I tend to work well under pressure. So again, I thought this would be an interesting experiment. But let's keep going. The bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. But if the individual overwhelmed by the sense of his own. I've always been embarrassed by my own intelligence, my own intellect, my own ability to understand things, because I always did badly in school. And so, I think for me, part of doing this is just trying to get past that shame and that embarrassment and say, like, maybe it's about, this is what it looks like to try and absorb something that is not quickly and easily absorbable, but which is clearly relevant and important. The man who looks only outside and quails before the big battalions has no resources with which to combat the evidence of his senses and his reason. But that is just what is happening today. We are all fascinated and overawed by statistical truths on large numbers, and are daily apprised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, since it is not represented and personified by any mass organization. I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit. Okay. Chapter 2, religion as maybe, okay, so chapter 1, what's the biggest thing I've taken away from that? Knowing I skipped around a lot and didn't really process all of it. The idea that we don't know ourselves at a deeper level. We tend to project outwards. If we see behavior that we don't like in others, we point the finger and we say, that's them and that's not me, not realizing that a lot of the time what we are seeing is a reflection of ourselves. Okay, chapter 2, religion as the counterbalance to mass-mindedness. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it, from every wholesome restriction, all socio-political movements tending in this direction invariably try to cut the ground from under the religions. I'll read that again. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it, from every wholesale restriction, all socio-political movements tending in this direction invariably try to cut the ground from under the religions. For in order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything besides the state must be taken from him. That's interesting. In order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything besides the state must be taken from him. It's a scary, kind of a scary thought, right? So I want to read the sentence before that again. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, I can't say I really know what that means. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it. So the idea of those who have a sense of individuality. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state from every wholesome restriction. And thank you, Lynette. Good analysis. I don't know what that was referring to, but I'm glad that I did a good job of analyzing something, because I'm trying here. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it. I guess the sovereign state, maybe he's just referring to the idea, not state in terms of like the United States, but state in terms of our own. Oh, hi.
I've eaten 2,000 tortillas in my life.
You've eaten 2,000 tortillas in your life?
That's more than you.
That's definitely more than me. That's amazing.
I'm done laughing.
Okay. Sorry about that. Oh, good analysis for chapter 1. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like that was some of it. I feel like there was some sovereign state of mind. Yes, state of mind, how we each see ourselves individually. Absolutely. Yes, so in order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, what does he mean to free the fiction of the sovereign state? The idea that we are all our own individual sovereign state of mind, how we see it. The idea that we're not really.
Even though you're older?
Wait, I'm doing a live stream right now.
Oh.
You're on the internet. You're blurry. Um, okay. But religion, okay, sorry, where was I here? Free the, and thanks for the encouragement here, Lynette, I appreciate it. In order to free the fiction of the sovereign state, in other words, the whims of those who manipulate it from every wholesome restriction, all socio-political movements tending in this direction. So all socio-political movements tending in the direction of, I guess, autonomy, um, sovereign, individuality. So all socio-political movements tending this direction invariably try to cut the ground from under the religions. He has religions in italics. So I see. So I think what he's saying is political movements trying to promote individuality try to disconnect us from religion. I think, if I'm understanding that right. Because then he says, for in order to turn the individual into a function of the state, his dependence on anything besides the state must be taken from him. So in other words, if you want to make people less free, you need to remove anything that they can turn to help give them a sense of autonomy besides the state. I think that's what he's saying. But religion means dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of experience. These do not refer directly to social and physical conditions. They concern far more the individual's psychic attitude. Sorry, I need to drink water. Lynette, thank you for hanging out with me. Religion means dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of experience. That's interesting, right? He's defining religion as like a personal experience, not as like dogma. These do not refer directly to social and physical conditions. They can serve for, okay. But it is possible to have an attitude to the external conditions of life only when there is a point of reference outside them. The religions give or claim to give such a standpoint, thereby enabling the individual to exercise his judgment and his power of decision. They build up a reserve, as it were, against the obvious and inevitable force of circumstances to which everyone is exposed who lives only in the outer world. Sorry, I need to close the door. You like the picture my daughter drew on the little, where is it? A little whiteboard behind me. The religions, however, teach another authority opposed to that of the world. The religions teach another authority opposed to that of the world. I feel like I need to read other of, kids are cool, other of Carl Jung's writing that really helps me because he was really a mystic, and I didn't really realize this until recently. Someone else shared with me about reading about his writings about the afterlife. And so he really had a personal relationship. He was a mystical guy, right? He gets labeled a psychoanalyst, but he really was a mystic. And so he had his own personal relationship with religion. So when he says here, the religions, however, teach another authority opposed to that of the world. I agree with that, right? That's not how religion tends to be practiced or talked about mostly, and especially now. But okay, the doctrine of the individual's dependence on God makes just as high a claim upon him as the world does. The doctrine of the individual's dependence on God. Okay. It may even happen that the absoluteness of this claim estranges him from the world in the same way he is estranged from himself when he succumbs to the collective mentality. He can forfeit his judgment and power. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But I think so far what I'm getting in this chapter is he talks about how religion is sort of an alternative to society, maybe to government, right? Religion is something for people to believe in that can sort of free them And it's interesting that he sees religion that way, if I'm understanding this correctly. And so, in a way, government will seek to undermine individual connection to religion, I think, which is also interesting when you think about Christian nationalism, right? And this idea the government now is attempting to institute the role that religion is meant to serve, what religion is, and sort of create this manipulated view of religion, which obviously a lot of people buy into. So, maybe in a lot of ways he's sort of he's speaking to what's presented as religion, what's presented as Christianity is, as I've heard many people say, nothing that Jesus would ever even recognize. The religions, however, teach another authority opposed to that of the world. The doctrine of the individual's dependence on God makes just as high a claim upon him as the world does. The doctrine of the individual's dependence on God makes just as high a claim upon him as the world does. Let's take a deep breath together. He mentions Buddhism in the next paragraph, so I want to read that. This is the goal the religions openly aspire to, unless they compromise with the state. So he said he can forfeit his judgment and power. I don't know if I'm making any kind of sense here. Let me read this. A creed is a confession of faith intended chiefly for the world at large and is thus an intramundane affair. I've never even heard that word. While the meaning and purpose of religion lie in the relationship of the individual to God. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or the path of salvation and liberation, Buddhism. From this basic fact, all ethics is derived, which without the individual's responsibility before God can be called nothing more than conventional morality. He's losing me a little bit, but since they are compromises, I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit. It is a little bit like sort of trying to learn a foreign language when you, sorry to close the window. When you sort of learn to deduce the essence of what's being said, even though you can't necessarily understand every single word. But he definitely seems to be talking about this contradiction between religion and individuals' connection to religion and self, and what society attempts to need definitions for his bigger concepts based on what he means. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't the best first book to read by Carl Jung. So maybe I really got in over my head here, but I'm taking some interest in this. I'm still glad that I'm engaging in this experiment. But yeah, again, I think it's the sort of conflict between religion, and he's using religion in this case, I think, as a vehicle for self-knowledge and self-understanding, and the conflict between that and leadership that attempts to control people, if that makes sense. So where should we go from here? Just as man, a social being, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community. I kind of like this idea of taking like really heady texts, and this isn't even like super heady, but I think of like some things maybe I read in college. For some reason, this book Orientalism by Edward Said comes to mind for some random reason, as maybe it was one of the most heady things I read when I was studying Middle Eastern studies at one point in college. And I like the idea of just taking something really heady and trying to interpret it live, which I guess is kind of what I'm doing here. This is it, right? This is how we expand our mind, right? I think this is how we grow. This is important. I've always been afraid of being perceived as stupid. I know I'm not stupid, but school and a lot of experiences in my career really led me to feel like I was quite unintelligent. And so I think intelligence is a muscle. I think learning is a muscle that most of us don't develop in school, because school was not actually about learning. It was about conformity. Anyway, going on a tangent. Uh, just as man, a social being, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real, and I just lost my one audience member. So now it's really just for me, which is good, which was kind of the whole point of this anyway. Um, just as man, as a social being, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence. And I think I was just getting too self-conscious. Just as man, as a social being, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence in his own spiritual and moral autonomy anywhere except in an extra-mundane principle capable of relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. That's an interesting sentence. I'm going to read that again. The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. I've never heard the word blandishments before, but what he's saying is, like, if you're not connected to God, and you can interpret God, however you want, how do you offer resistance to how others might try to stamp you? You're sort of a victim to the whims of the world, or those who might try to control you. For this, he needs the evidence of inner transcendent experience, which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass. I think he's saying that if you have inner transcendent experience, this can protect you from, he says, submersion in the mass, from being swept up in, what was this chapter called again? Religion as the counterbalance to mass-mindedness. Yeah, so he's saying without transcendent experience gives you power to not be swept up in what I guess he calls mass-mindedness. Hopefully that makes sense. That's really interesting. Merely intellectual or even moral insight into the stultification and moral irresponsibility of the mass man is a negative recognition only, and amounts to not much more than a wavering on the road to the atomization of the individual. It lacks the driving force of religious conviction, since it is merely rational. The dictator state has one great advantage over bourgeois reason. Along with the individual, it swallows up his religious forces. The state has taken the place of God. The dictator state, this is interesting, because it sounds like what we're experiencing now here in the US. The dictator state has one great advantage over bourgeois reason. I'm not really sure what he means by that. Along with the individual, it swallows up his religious forces. Along with the individual, it swallows up his religious forces. This is like Christian nationalism. The state has taken the place of God. Think about that. The state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions, and state slavery is a form of worship. This is what's happening. This is why this book is relevant right now. I'm going to read that again. He's talking about knowing God personally. He's talking about having transcendent experiences. You think about taking psychedelics, you think about connecting with nature, and how these experiences, what happens with these experiences is they help educate us to the truth of who we really are, that we're more than just this human, right? And those experiences, basically, he says, protect us. I'm paraphrasing, but he's saying transcendent experiences, knowing God directly, prevent us or protect us from being swallowed by mass mindedness, as he calls it. Does that make sense? So having transcendent experiences protects us from being swallowed by groupthink. Another way of putting it. But then he says, merely intellectual or even moral insight into the stultification, I have no idea what that word means, into the stultification and moral irresponsibility of the mass man. So understanding intellectually, insight into the stultification. I have a sense of what stultification. You ever read a word and you're like, I kind of feel like I know what it means. So I think he's saying intellectually and having moral insight into how people in groups, mass-mindedness, as he says, limits us, is a negative recognition only and amounts to not much more than a wavering on the road to the atomization of the individual. That's a heavy sentence. But I think what he's saying is, I'm having fun, by the way. If anyone's watching this, I hope you're enjoying this. Lynette said good experience. So great. That was the goal. And again, I think what he's saying is simply being intellectually aware or even having moral insight into how maybe society stunts individuals isn't really worth much. It doesn't really help us. He's saying what you really need are transcendental experiences, a direct connection to God. Again, however you define God. It lacks the driving force of religious conviction, since it is merely rational. And then this is so fascinating. And this is so relevant. I'm behind and can type more now. At the time Jung wrote this, religion was the way people were able to access transcendental experiences. That's fascinating, right? That's where I lack context, because all I see is the role that religion plays in society today. And it makes sense that maybe in the 50s, religion was more a vehicle to access the divine, whereas now it's a means of maybe kind of more like mind control. So it's interesting to think that, yeah, maybe in the 50s, more people saw religion and experienced religion as a form of personal empowerment. I don't know, but yeah, that's what you just said, basically. So that's cool. But this is fascinating. I want to read this again because it's so relevant to today. I'm gonna take a deep breath first. Let's take a drink of water. So he says, the dictator state has one great advantage over bourgeois reason. I don't really understand what he means by bourgeois reason, but bourgeois reason. The dictator state has one great advantage over bourgeois reason. Along with the individual, it swallows up his religious forces. But I get that, the idea that the dictator state, which is what we're looking at right now in the US, it swallows up individual autonomy. It swallows up individuals' ability to know God, to know their own transcendence. The state has taken the place of God. The state has taken the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions and state slavery is a form of worship. State slavery is a form of worship. But the religious function cannot be dislocated and falsified in this way without giving rise to secret doubts, which are immediately repressed so as to avoid conflict with the prevailing trend towards mass-mindedness. Excuse me. I don't know, I feel like there's so much in here that's so fascinating. I'm just going to read that one more time. But the religious function cannot be dislocated and falsified in this way without giving rise to secret doubts. In other words, like, you tell people, believe in the state, believe in Christian nationalism, you're going to feel something in your body that's going to say, this isn't right, which are immediately repressed. And so the tendency is going to be to repress, to ignore those feelings, which are immediately repressed so as to avoid conflict with the prevailing trend towards mass-mindedness. In other words, in order to fit in with society, we're going to ignore our feelings It's what most of us do. I spend my life doing. The result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism, which in its turn is used as a weapon for stamping out the least flicker of opposition. This is fascinating to me. So in other words, you know, and he's saying people, gosh, how do I interpret this? The religious function to immediately repress. So people repress what they know at a deeper level to be true, because if they don't do that, they'll stick out. And cancel culture. Is this cancel culture? Cancel culture. So canceling, that's interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have equated this with cancel culture, but that's an interesting take. But I love the idea that the result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism. So, you know, people who are just fanatical about their beliefs, and this is where he talks about like rationality, intellectual insight not being enough because people get hung up on what they believe, ignoring what they actually feel. So the result, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism, which in its turn is used as a weapon for stamping out the least flicker of opposition. Free opinion is stifled and moral decision ruthlessly suppressed on the plea that the end justifies the means, even the vilest. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demigod beyond good and evil, and his votaries are honored as heroes, martyrs, apostles, missionaries. It's fascinating how relevant this is, right now. There's only one truth. It's also good, like, it's kind of encouraging in a way that, like, what we're experiencing right now isn't really anything new. And at the same time, that kind of gives the hope that we can be informed and educated enough to help steer society in a different direction. That's what this awakening, the awakening of consciousness is about, in my opinion. The policy of the state is exalted to a creed. The leader or party boss becomes a demigod beyond good or evil. I don't even need to say any more about how relevant that is. And his votaries, I don't know the word votaries, are honored as heroes, martyrs, apostles, missionaries. Who comes to mind? A lot of people coming to mind for me right now. There's only one truth, and beside it, no other. It is sacrosanct and above criticism. Anyone who thinks differently is a heretic, who, as we know from history, is threatened with all manner of unpleasant things. Is that cancel culture? Only the party boss who holds the political power in his hands can interpret the state doctrine authentically. And he does so just as suits him. It's prophetic. I mean, it's also not prophetic. He was just documenting what he saw, which is, again, what's happening now. Only the party boss who holds the political power in his hands can interpret the state doctrine authentically. And he does so just as suits him, right? When through mass rule, the individual becomes social unit, no so-and-so, and this, I don't understand. I'm just going to jump ahead because let's just read this. In order not to repeat myself unnecessarily, I shall not enumerate all the parallels between worldly and otherworldly beliefs, but shall content myself with emphasizing the fact that a natural function which has existed from the beginning, like the religious function, cannot be disposed of with rationalistic and so-called enlightened criticism. You can, of course, represent the doctrinal contents of the creeds as impossible and subject them to ridicule, but such methods miss the point and do not hit the religious function which forms the basis of the creeds. Religion, in the sense of conscientious regard for the irrational factors of the psyche and individual fate, reappears. As I have already pointed out, the dictator state, besides robbing the individual of his rights, votaries is people who voted. Okay, I kind of figured that's what I meant, but thank you for clarifying. As I have already pointed out, the dictator state, besides robbing the individual of his rights, has also cut the ground from under his feet physically by depriving him of the metaphysical foundations of his existence. The ethical decision of the individual human being no longer counts. What alone matters is the blind movement of the masses, and the lie has thus become the operative principle of political action. The state has drawn the logical conclusions from this as the existence of many millions of state slaves completely derived of all rights, immediately testify. So basically so the first chapter was, chapter 1 was basically about how we don't tend to know ourselves as well as we think we do. For most of us, self-awareness, self-knowledge is about understanding our personality. But the ego or the personality only knows itself, and it doesn't know what's deeper than it, what's driving it in many ways. And then in the second chapter, he talks about, again, I keep forgetting the title, religion as the counterbalance to mass-mindedness. So he talks about religion is actually a vehicle to go beyond this, to go beyond the surface, go beyond just being intellectual beings associated with our egos. But he talks about how government, he doesn't use the word government, he talks about the state, tends to undermine individuals' autonomy, and in some cases, by sort of being its own religion. So, chapter 3, the position of the West on the questions of religion. Confronting this development in the 20th century of our Christian era, the Western world stands, it's interesting, right? The 20th century of our Christian era. It's so easy to forget that our system for documenting years is just rooted in Christianity. I don't know why that's so relevant, but it seems relevant. Maybe it's easy to forget how much, I guess, certain interpretations of Christianity have shaped the world that we live in. I don't know if that makes sense. Confronting this development in the 20th century of our Christian era, the Western world stands with its heritage of Roman law, the treasures of Judeo-Christian ethics grounded on metaphysics, and its ideal of the inalienable rights of man. Anxiously, it asks itself this question: how can this development be brought to a standstill or put into reverse? It is useless to pillory the socialist dictatorship as utopian and to condemn its economic principles as unreasonable, because in the first place, the criticizing West has only itself to talk to, its arguments being heard only on this side of the Iron Curtain. And in the second place, any economic principles you like can be put into practice so long as you are prepared to accept the sacrifices they entail. You can carry through any social and economic reforms you please if, like Stalin, you let 3 million peasants starve to death and have a few million unpaid laborers at your disposal. Let's read that again. You can carry through any social and economical reforms you please if, like Stalin, you let 3 million peasants starve to death and have a few million unpaid laborers at your disposal. A state of this kind has no social or economic crisis to fear. So long as its power is intact, that is to say, so long as there is a well-disciplined and well-fed police army in the offing, it can maintain its existence for an indefinitely long period and go on increasing its power to an indefinite extent. In accordance with, I think he's getting at, like, how do you overcome the power of dictatorships? And he says it's useless to pillory the socialist dictatorship as utopia. What does pillory mean? I'm gonna Google that. I think it means to, like, attack something, to take it down. A pillory is a historical wooden or metal apparatus that locked an offender's head and hands in place to expose them to public shame and abuse, public humiliation and deterrence. That's interesting. That's what a pillory is. Pillory is that device that locks up your hands and your head so they can chop your head off. But what it represents is public humiliation and deterrence rather than physical punishment. Let me read that again. Where was it? It is useless to pillory the social dictatorship as utopian I don't understand. Why would you pillory the socialist dictatorship as utopian and to condemn its economic principles as unreasonable? Because in the first place, the criticizing West has only itself to talk to, its arguments being heard only on this side of the Iron Curtain. And in the second place, any economic principles you like can be put into practice so long as you are prepared to accept the sacrifices they entail. So I think this chapter is generally about, what do you do? How do we find our way through this? How do we help people find their individual autonomy? The absolute state has an army of fanatical missionaries to do its bidding. This is true in matters of foreign policy. And these in turn can count on a fifth column who are guaranteed asylum under the laws and constitution of the Western states. In addition to the communes of believers, very strong in places, considerably weaken Western governments' powers of, jump ahead. But that's true, right? The absolute state has an army of fanatical missionaries to do its bidding. I can kind of stop there. The West has unfortunately not yet awakened to the fact that our appeal to idealism and reason and other desirable virtues delivered with so much enthusiasm is mere sound and fury. Sounds like Beethoven or Shakespeare. Is a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, however twisted this faith may appear to us. The West has unfortunately not yet awakened to the fact that our appeal to idealism and reason and other desirable virtues delivered with so much enthusiasm is mere sound and fury. That's something that's kind of scary. Like, I don't want to fall victim to that. I don't want to fall victim to just harping on with enthusiasm, but being just mere sound and fury. He says it is a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, however twisted this faith may appear to us. Puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith, because the storm of religious faith is very powerful. I think I got that right. We are faced not with a situation that can be overcome by rational or moral arguments. So that's a good point. The situation we're up against can't be overcome through rational or moral arguments, but with an unleashing of emotional forces and ideas engendered by the spirit of the times. And these, as we know from experience, are not much influenced by rational reflection and still less by moral exhortation. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmic, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic inflection. Unhappily, the little word should, which never fails to appear in this connection, points to a certain weakness, if not the absence of this desideratum. It's using a lot of words I don't understand, but what's coming to mind here is like the Summer of Love, 1969, is that the Summer of Love? And the counterculture of the 60s and the 70s that were maybe one of the most powerful movements the world has ever seen, because it wasn't about fighting against, it wasn't about rational, like he says here, we are faced not with a situation that can be overcome by rational or moral arguments, right? So the movement of the counterculture in the 60s and 70s wasn't about rational or moral arguments. It was about transcendence, right? And there's a reason that LSD was outlawed, because it facilitated this transcendence that was a direct threat to what was happening at the time, right? Like the Vietnam War. So his point is we can't overcome, we're not going to win against an authoritarian dictatorship through rational and moral arguments. It's going to get us nowhere. We're going to end up, this is what he means when he says delivered with so much enthusiasm, but being mere sound and fury, a puff of wind swept away in the storm of religious faith. So what do we do? he says, the antidote. So this is the antidote. Maybe I'll kind of wind it down here. Hello, Rafal, thanks for joining. So we're talking about the undiscovered self. I've kind of skimmed through the first 2 chapters. I'm on the 3rd. The first chapter, he's talking about how kind of self-knowledge and how mostly in society, when we talk about self-knowledge, most of us are coming from a place of not really knowing ourselves, because we think of self-knowledge as an intellectual understanding of who we are. And in our intellect only knows our intellect. And give me an antidote. Yeah. Let's get to it. So he says, most of us don't know ourselves is basically what chapter 1 is about, because we are much more than our intellect. We're much more than our egos. And then in chapter 2, the title of chapter 2 was Religion as the Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness. Bit of a heady title, but basically what he's talking about is religion, as he is interpreting it, is religion is about transcendence. It's not about buying into ideologies or dogma. You know, religion in his view is about really knowing yourself, knowing your transcendent nature, knowing who we really are at a deeper level. And that is, I mean, that is the antidote. In a word, that is the antidote, is religion, but not in the way that most people interpret religion. And again, he's interpreting religion in terms of really knowing yourself at a deeper level. Okay, and so now chapter 3, he's talking about, and all this is incredibly relevant to what's happening today. So he's talking about dictatorships, and dictatorships sort of become a form of religion, and attempt to disempower people by taking away their autonomy. Okay, so what's the antidote? He says the antidote isn't rational or moral arguments. Where was I? We are faced. So the point of religion would be not to believe in any of its particular stories, but to show that there are infinite ways of being godly and demonly. Yeah. You know, religion, a term that I learned recently in spiritual context, is the term of direct experience. And it speaks to the idea that true spirituality isn't about believing in ideas, not necessarily believing in stories, but it's about what do I feel in my body? What's my own personal experience? What's my own personal relationship? So I'm going to read this and then I'm going to wrap this up because we're at the hour. Living the stories. Yes. Yeah. And it's not that stories aren't valuable, right? It's not that there's not value in these stories, but it's that the stories alone aren't enough. The stories should be pointer, just like spiritual texts aren't about like memorization, right? We all learned, school was all about memorization, right? And so a lot of religion is about learning ideas. But the ideas are just pointers to a deeper truth. Eckhart Tolle talks a lot about that. Okay, so I'm going to read this and then I'm going to wrap this up. And thank you so much for joining me here, guys. I've enjoyed this, and I'm definitely going to do this again. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmic, never heard that word in my life, the antidote should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic inflection. Actually, I think Jung was saying Christianity was the best mode to access transcendent experiences. 70 years later, interesting. I think Jung was saying Christianity was the best mode to access transcendent experiences 70 years later. And yes, exactly what Rafal mentions. I like your point that ideas are pointers. I agree on many levels. Okay, so this is the last thought. I just want to read it one more time because I love this idea. It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmic, I got to Google that word, sorry. Have you guys ever heard that word in your life? Alexa, and then he follows it with the antidote. So I guess it means something like an antidote. Alexipharmic is a word with two main meanings. As an adjective, it describes something that wards off poisoning or infection. Makes sense. As a noun, it refers to a substance that acts as an antidote or a protective agent against toxins or infections. The word comes from the ancient Greek for to ward off poison. So I'll read this one more time, and then I'm going to wrap this up. And thank you so much for joining me here. It has been correctly realized, because this is great. This is like, what do we need to do? What do we need to do against what's happening in the world, in my country and around the world? It has been correctly realized in many quarters that the alexipharmic, the antidote, should in this case be an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind. An equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind. And that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. The danger of psychic infection, the danger of having our minds controlled, the danger of being taken over by what our government or our leaders want us to believe. So let's all practice having an equally potent faith if only the current state of religions was non-material. Elixir plus pharma equals antidote. So let's all practice having, with the enthusiasm that dictators have, let's practice having an equally, I fully believe in this, that if we want to overcome what's happening in the world right now, that we have to embody an equal enthusiasm for, it's not that protest is bad, not that we shouldn't be out there on the streets protesting, but we need to embody an equal enthusiasm within ourselves, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? I love how he says the antidote should be an equally potent is key. Somewhat difficult for me personally to embody enthusiasm for full spirit when the body hurts, reminding of endings. It requires healing, right? It requires us to really dive deep, go deep within ourselves, and it's not easy, and that's why it's easier to remain intellectual, I guess. And I get it, I think. But once again, an equally potent faith of a different and non-materialistic kind, and that the religious attitude grounded upon it would be the only effective defense against the danger of psychic infection. So protect yourselves against psychic infection. That's the key. Okay, I got up to page 35. That's not bad. This is 106 pages. I've had this book for 20 years, and I don't think I've ever even opened it until today. So thank you so much, guys, for hanging out with me. And I really enjoyed doing this. I think this is a good exercise on many levels. And I would love to do this again. So thanks for joining. And I apologize, guys, but I got to run. But thank you so much for being here. If anyone's watching this recording, would love to hear your reflections. And see you soon.